Hey everybody, so a bit of a different tier list today since I'm not actually updating an older video. Today we're going to be talking about every single subclass in the game, including Prismatic, which released with the final shape recently, and we're going to be analyzing, tiering, scoring them all for endgame viability. Now, some of you might have remembered that video collab that I had with Above and Salted Repo, where we kind of ping-ponged ideas off each other and talked about subclasses, and that got me thinking, I really want to solidify my ideas on why certain subclasses are great, why some of them are not so great for endgame content, and so I decided to come up with this system where I have 5 different factors: abilities, builds, survivability, damage, and movement, that I can all score and kind of use them to semi-objectively rate the subclasses, and then from there I could subjectively create some tiers where I would have certain thresholds for points, and I'd be like, yeah, these are S tier I feel like, these are A tier I feel like, etc, etc. Now you'll notice the abilities column is actually gone. We only have a builds column now, and the reason for that is because when I was remaking this tier list, I kind of realized that the abilities and builds column were basically identical with the details that I put into each one. For example, like builds, you would have Sunbreaker Solar Grenade spam as a benefit for Solar Warlock, and then the abilities would say, Touch of Flame Solar Grenade, which is like essentially the same thing, right? So the reason why I've set these up into these 4 factors specifically, with builds being ranked up to 10, survivability up to 10, damage up to 10, movement up to 3, because movement is a much smaller factor. The reason why I set them up like this is because I believe endgame content has basically 3 pillars, right? 3 main pillars. Number 1 is how much can your abilities help you add clear? Right, add clear and maybe do mini boss, champ damage, that sort of thing, right? So we're thinking stuff like, Speaker Sight Healing Grenade spam for team sustain, you have Sunbreaker Solar Grenade spam, Controverse Vortex Grenade spam, that sort of thing, right? Those are builds. You have survivability. Survivability is how much can the subclass itself help you survive, whether we're talking damage resistance, de-aggro from invis or something else like Threaded Spectre, sustain through healing, or some sort of, devour is another good example. And then finally we have damage. So damage, I'm talking specifically boss damage, not mini boss damage, not champ damage, boss damage specifically. So what are we looking for? Damage supers. We have abilities like grenades that can do some fair amount of damage. We have buffs, we have debuffs, we have can your subclass help you load your weapons or give you a reload buff for boss damage. All of these things, I think these 3 things are like the pinnacles of endgame content, right? Can your build help you kill stuff? Can your build help you survive? And can your build help you do boss damage? That's the main 3, right? So that's why I've rated all of these for a total maximum score of 30. Movement, I gave 3 points to. This is kind of just, I'm a speedrunner, so obviously I perceive endgame content being partially as, playing optimally or maybe playing as quickly as possible. And so movement is a big factor for me in that case. However, for some of you who, don't really care about speedrunning or don't really care about movement, worry not, because even with this movement factor not accounted for, the tiers basically remain the same. So you can kind of, use this tier list as some sort of guideline or reference, all the same, regardless of whether you care about movement or not, because the amount of points that I assign to movement are so low that they don't really affect the tiering whatsoever. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's actually get on with this tier list and start off with Solar Warlock. So starting off our tier list, I kind of have to put Solar Warlock in the S tier. Now, despite the recent gutting of Well of Radiance, with tier 3 restoration being reduced down to tier 2, with the team DR being absolutely gutted, it's still an excellent choice for endgame content, and that's for a couple reasons. It received a 9 score in builds because Speaker Sight Healing Grenade spam on Touch of Flame is absolutely still excellent and one of the best ways to survive in team content and solo content. Still absolutely excellent, very, very easy to use, super survivable. Sunbracers is still pretty strong. Now, the Empyrean nerf did hit Sunbracers builds pretty hard, even though the actual Sunbracers nerf didn't hit the exotic that hard, but it's still a viable pick for endgame content if you want to do splash damage. You also have access to stuff like Starfire, Karnstein, there's plenty of builds that you can use with Well of Radiance, with Song of Flame, and so I just kind of put a couple in here that I thought were particularly notable, and that's still enough to get this thing to a 9 out of 10 when it comes to builds. Now, survivability wise, I had to give this thing a 10, right? From front to back, you have healing, you have crazy damage resist for solo, excellent damage resist for team environments that is very, very suitable for long-term engagements. You have Ember of Empyrean, Ember of Resolve, Phoenix Dive Heat Rises with Empyrean extension for restoration ×2 from both your grenade and your dive. So excellent sustain. The only thing this subclass is lacking really is going to be de-aggro, so some sort of invis or some sort of, clone creation, but that's really not that relevant given how much healing you can force down into a single guardian with this subclass's abilities. Now damage, I gave this an 8 out of 10, and that's only really because this subclass is missing a strong damage super. Now you can argue that Star Eater Song of Flame is not too bad for damage, but only on Prismatic. Because Solar Warlock doesn't have access to exotic class items, obviously you're going to have to use base Song of Flame, which is pretty bad for damage, and really if you're going to be using Song of Flame on Solar Warlock, I would strongly suggest either using it for ad clear or just for solo damage so you can have that crazy amount of damage resist, scorching rounds, and constant radiant for a damage phase. Speaking of constant radiant, this thing has a great option for buffing. Well of Radiance is still one of the easiest ways to provide an entire team with a 25% buff for pretty much any boss damage phase length in the entire game. Song of Flame is excellent for solo content, it's great for team content, it gives you basically pre-nerf well DR for your entire team, and it also provides you with Radiant while also giving your teammates ability regen. You have Ember of Torches, which is better than Facet of Dawns, pretty mediocre Radiant duration. You have reloads from Rain of Fire Icarus Dash, and of course you have Touch of Flame Solar Grenades, which are surprisingly decent for boss DPS as well. So I had to give this thing an 8 out of 10. The only thing it's really missing is like a Nighthawk or a Nova Bomb or something like that, which you'll see some of the other subclasses get much higher scores on, specifically like 10s and 9s. So this is not bad. It's got everything, all the earmarks that you want for a solid subclass for boss damage. It's just missing a damage super. Finally, we have movement. I give it 3 out of 3, right? I mean, it has Heat Rises, Icarus Dash, Phoenix Dive, Well Skating. It is the movement subclass. That being said, even if this was a 27, I still put it in the S tier. And yeah, that's all I have to say about Solar Warlock. Next up, we have Solar Hunter. Now, what a fall from grace. Unfortunately, we're going to have to slap this one in the C tier. And the reason for that is because Solar Hunter has, number one, I think it's pretty clear to everyone that Solar Hunter has been completely and utterly eclipsed by Prismatic Hunter. Now, one of the reasons why people tried so hard to make Solar Hunter work, despite Solar Hunter having relatively mediocre build access in my opinion, and relatively mediocre survivability as well, is because Solar Hunter was attached to one of the best damage supers, if not the best damage super in the game, in Celestial Nighthawk Goldie. Now, you can argue, there's Feast of Light Blade Barrage as well, but for the most part, we're looking at Goldie here. And so people really tried hard to make this thing work in like a solo damage environment, in like a survivability environment. But if you look objectively at the builds that are available to Solar Hunter and the survivability access it has through its abilities, it's pretty clear why everyone has abandoned it in favor of Prismatic Hunter. Build-wise, really the only thing you can look at is like Cowl Knife Trick, which is not particularly good. Knife Trick doesn't scale particularly well into endgame content without some sort of melee damage buff, which Solar Hunter does not have access to if you choose to take Cowl. You have survivability in Healing Grenade, but it's base Healing Grenade, which is Resto ×1, not great. You have Ember of Empyrean. You could also go the option of Ember of Mercy with something like Sunshot and Ember of Searing, but again, that's still just Resto ×1 and still requires a lot of kill chaining for a relatively mediocre survivability effect. Next up, we have damage. I mean, obviously, Celestial Goldie is great, Ember of Torches is fine, but there's no real consistent way to either debuff the target. You have reload dodge, but all Hunter subclasses have access there, so I didn't really want to give it like specific points for that. But there's no real way to keep Radiant up for like an entire phase specifically. So, a Solar Hunter is fine, right? Damage-wise, obviously was its strongest suit, but if we're looking objectively at it, it is a bit of a fall from grace because build-wise, neutral gameplay on this subclass is objectively pretty weak, and so I gave it 11 points and tossed it into the C tier. Next up, we have Solar Titan. Now, Solar Titan has been a fan favorite for a while. Obviously, that mini hammer build that everyone was using has been very strong, one of the strongest Titan builds over the past couple of years, but how does it hold up to today's sandbox? Well, in response, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the B tier. Now, if we're ranking Solar Titan holistically, we have to kind of be honest here, right? Build-wise, if we're thinking offensive potential, these are the two main builds that Solar Titans are looking at. Pyrogale Consecration, which has been completely overshadowed by Prismatic Titan, or Synthecep's Mini Throwing Hammer, which has been completely gutted ever since the Throwing Hammer rate of fire reduction. And so it feels really awkward to play Throwing Hammer. Consecration is fine, it does great splash damage, and Consecration itself is a pretty high base damage melee, even without access to some sort of melee buff. However, as soon as you play Prismatic Titan, you start to realize that it's really Consecration that's carrying that build, and not necessarily the other parts of Solar Titan. Survivability wise, it's pretty good, but you never have access to anything higher than Resto tier 1, so you don't have access to Touch of Flame in the same way that Solar Warlock does. In addition, your damage resist sources are basically just Consecration while you're mid-air in the middle of the animation, which you don't have access to if you're on Throwing Hammer. So while Solar Titan does feel like a bit of a tank if you're in those sunspots and you're hammering stuff, you're getting Cure on hit, I did give it a 6 out of 10, which, you know, might sound like a low score, right? But if you look at the other stuff that's gotten a 10 or even a 9 or even an 8 for survivability, it's kind of clear why a melee focused subclass where you need to keep throwing hammers at enemies that are melee range and get cure on hit and kill them to make sunspots is not as consistent or survivable as some of the other stuff that I've given higher scores in survivability to. Damage-wise, you have Pyrogale Burning Maul, which is okay. It's a situational damage super that is outshined by both Curious Thundercrash and Star Eater Scale's Twilight Arsenal. So not superb, not amazing. You know, you did have a Hammer of Soul buff recently, but that doesn't really change anything because, you know, you'd probably rather be using something like Star Eater on specifically Prismatic Titan as well. So not great. I mean, you have Ember of Torches on an infinitely refreshable powered melee, but that's only if you're in melee range. Not going to give it too much credit for that. Well of Radiance is a lot easier to facilitate and a lot more popular as well. Movement wise, obviously we have 0 points here, so I'm going to give this thing a total score of 15, and we're going to leave it in the B tier and move on to Arc. Arc Warlock is up next. Now Arc Warlock is kind of you know, it's not horrible. I wouldn't say any of these subclasses are like unplayable or anything like that, but it is going to go in the D tier. Now we gave it a total of 8 points, and now why is that? Well, build-wise, Arc Warlock doesn't really have that strong offensive potential that we're really looking for. If we compare it to even something like a Solar Titan, which I gave a middling score of a 5. This thing has, what, Vesper of Radius Rift Spam? I mean, I guess it's decent for sustain. You can blind some enemies around you. You know, people have used this build with a Glaive before in GMs, but in terms of raw offensive potential, is it really that strong? Not really, I wouldn't say so. Fallen Sunstar ability spam with Electrostatic Mind and Cold Heart is also popular in order to spam pulse grenades, but is that even really that strong compared to something like a Solar Titan where you're leaving sunspots all the time? You're actually able to deal with mini bosses with your subclass rather than with your weapons? I wouldn't say so. I think a 3 out of 10 is a fair assessment when we compare it to the other builds that are available on the other subclasses. Survivability wise, you don't really have anything. I mean, you have Sustain. Arc Soul does increase your Rift regeneration rate, which I'll give it some credit for. You have damage resist from Spark of Resistance in case you're surrounded. I mean, that's kind of helpful if you're on Vesper of Radius and you need to be near enemies, but again, that's incurred risk for not really a payoff that I perceive as being really worth taking. So in my opinion, builds-wise, survivability-wise, not great. And then damage-wise, you kind of have nothing, right? You have Arc Soul Rifts, which I will give some credit for. Arc Soul is a not insignificant damage increase if you are able to give it to your entire team, which notably, unlike Prismatic Warlock, you don't have the Arc Soul aspect on Prismatic Warlock, and that's the one that allows you to share your Arc Soul with all of your teammates and provide them with essentially 6 firing turrets instead of just 1. So I will give it a little bit of credit for giving Arc Soul to your teammates, but given the fact that Geomag, Stabilizers, Chaos Reach, or Storm Trance, or any of those supers are legitimately just worse than doing weapon damage, I'm not going to list them here or give any points for them. So that's going to be a score of 2, and obviously there's not really any movement tech on Arc Warlock, so that's going to result in a total score of 8 for our first Arc subclass. Next up on our list is Arc Hunter, which is unfortunately another casualty of Prismatic Hunter, so funnily enough it ends up in the same tier as Solar Hunter in the C tier. Now the reason for this is kind of multifold, right? So build wise, you have Cowl Combination Blow, which, you know, I've heralded as a pretty strong build in the past. However, by modern standards, if we account for the fact that Solar Titan has a 5 in builds, I think Arc Hunter is a fair amount weaker than Solar Titan. It's less consistent. You don't have sunspots everywhere to give you constant resto in case you have hammer downtime. You don't have really a way of dealing with mini bosses that's as refreshable as Solar Titan. And of course, you don't have access to cure on hit rather than healing on kill specifically. So as a result, I did place Arc Hunter a little bit lower than Solar Hunter in terms of builds. Survivability wise, it's also a little bit worse. You obviously have Combination Blow healing, but that's on kill. You have Spark of Resistance, but you know, the DR from there is not incredibly strong and only works while you're surrounded. And you do have Flow State DR, which is kind of notable. It's quite high, but it's only while you're dodging while amplified, which you are dodging while amplified relatively frequently, but I would say that's generally not when Arc Hunter is at its riskiest. Generally, Arc Hunter falters when you're running out of stacks or you don't have any enemies nearby that are weak that you can get some sort of refresh on, and Solar Titan doesn't really struggle from that problem as much, and so I've given builds and survivability factors a bit of a lower score on Arc Hunter. Obviously for damage, Star Eater Scale's Gathering Storm is still pretty good. It's not a horrible damage super or anything like that, but that's pretty much all Arc Hunter has access to. I'm not going to give Amplified any credit for increasing your handling, or even Flow State for increasing your reload. It's not particularly substantial in my opinion, and so I'm going to go ahead and give it a 3 score for damage, because the damage super is not bad, but there's really nothing else to give it any credit for. Movement wise, Arc Hunter does have access to Blink and Ascension, which I think are worth 1 point combined, but that's pretty much all there is to say for Arc Hunter at 12 points in the C tier. Our last Arc subclass is going to unfortunately have to be Arctitan in the D tier. Now the reason for this is, well, I think it's fairly obvious, isn't it? Arctitan was largely just used for Curious Thundercrash as a burst super, and I think for the most part, Twilight Arsenal with Star Eater scales on Prismatic is basically universally better, at least universally more applicable. You can certainly maybe use Thundercrash on a boss like Aatrax if you favor the slightly higher burst DPS, so you can squeeze in a Parasite or something like that, but for the most part, this subclass is pretty weak when it comes to neutral gameplay. Build-wise, the best you're going to get out of this thing is maybe like Hoil Pulse Grenade Spam. Point Contact Cannon Brace is okay, but doesn't really scale that well into really hard endgame content. Survivability-wise, you have what? Knockout Healing? You have Spark of Resistance? Yeah, I think Arctitan is maybe one of the least survivable subclasses in the game right now, so I gave it a score, the minimum score in fact, of 0 out of 10. Damage-wise, obviously Curious Thundercrash is still pretty decent. I gave it the same score as Star Eater Gathering Storm because I think they're kind of similar viability now. They're both decent, but they've been overshadowed by better supers on other subclasses, so I think they were both kind of 3 territory in my opinion. Obviously, Arctitan doesn't really have anything else that I think strongly contributes to damage. And finally, movement, we have a 0. Thruster doesn't really count. So that's a total score of 5, which leaves this thing pretty low in the D tier. Starting off our Void subclasses, we have Void Warlock with a total of 16 points, coming in right at the B tier next to Solar Titan. Now, the reason why Void Warlock is placed so high is because I think Void Warlock is overall a more survivable and consistent subclasses than the subclasses that are below it. We have, of course, decent builds. I wouldn't say they're crazy, offensive sustain or anything, but we have Controverse Vortex Grenade Spam, which is still respectable even in 2024. We have Briarbind's ability cycling, which I think a lot of people are fans of, using cycling with Child of the Old God and, non-Chaos Accelerant boosted Vortex Grenades instead, with a higher priority on cycling all of your abilities rather than just your grenade, which I think is, totally fine as well. Survivability-wise, Void Warlock is excellent. You have Enhanced Devour, so full heal on kill. You have a good amount of grenade energy coming back every kill as well. Echo of Starvation, so you can restart your cycle just by picking up an orb or a Void Breach. Echo of Obscurity, so you have access to Invis finisher in case you need to go in for like a clutch special finisher or like an Aeon finisher. So survivability, pretty good. And damage-wise, I would say Void Warlock is decent as well. You have Cataclysm Nova, which is not buffed by Star Eater scales, but even then is one of Warlock's fairly decent leading base damage supers. So I've given it around the same amount of points for super damage as I would for something like a Star Eater Gathering Storm or a Curious Thundercrash. However, on top of that, Void Warlock also provides probably the best debuff extension in the game using Child of the Old Gods, as well as Echo of Undermining, which allows you to extend a 30% debuff for a very, very long period of time for basically an entire damage phase if you so choose. Even if you're not speedrunner oriented or optimizing like that, Void Warlock is excellent for keeping at least a 15% weaken on a boss for basically an entire phase if you're managing your abilities even decently well, and that's why I've decided to give it a 4 out of 10 for damage rather than a 3 out of 10 compared to, for example, Arc Hunter or Arc Titan. Finally, Void Warlock also has access to Blink with Astrocyte, so that's, give it a little 1 for that, 1 out of 3, and that's going to result in a total of 16 points and a solid placement in the B tier. Next up, we have Void Hunter. Now, Void Hunter is also going to find its home in the B tier with slightly more points at 18 points, and Void Hunter is the kind of ultimate guaranteed survivability class, I suppose. You have Sustain through Invis Dodge, you have Stylish Executioner, you have Trapper's Ambush so you can make your teammates invisible, you have Echo of Starvation so you can kind of proc Devour anytime you pick up an orb or a Void Breach, same thing, Echo of Obscurity, same thing that all of the Void subclasses have access to, good survivability tools for sure. You have damage resistance from Omnioculus. Now, there haven't really been any recent raid or dungeon sort of day 1 events where Omnioculus TR has been super relevant, but I think it is a useful tool to have in your back pocket in case a team ever needs to traverse through an area where it's guaranteed danger and it's not really an area where you can have some sort of offensive presence. So I think DR from Omnioculus is still worth mentioning for survivability, even if it's not as relevant as it once was. Build-wise, I think Void Hunter is a little weaker on this front if we're thinking about offensive potential. Gyrfalcon's Volatile is okay, right? It's fine, but if we compare it to some of the stuff that Prismatic is bringing, that Prismatic is cooking, definitely nowhere near. Omnioculus and Graviton Chain Invisibility are still valid picks for more slow and sustained gameplay. You have Orpheus Rig Tether Spam, which obviously saw a big resurgence when it came to Legend Onslaught wave management, or even just, any sort of GM. If you throw an Orpheus Rig Tether in the middle of a room, or like a day 1 raid, certainly still useful in those instances. So I'm going to have to give it a 6 out of 10 for builds. Pretty strong, I would say, but lacking some offensive potential that stuff like Prismatic, wink wink, has access to. Finally, damage-wise, I mean, the damage supers on Void Hunter are very lackluster. Feast of Light Shadow Shot is pretty rough, like Mobius Quiver is pretty rough. Although Deadfall Tether is a nice 30% debuff, it's the only damage super in the game that has a full debuff and not a 15% weaken like Twilight Arsenal does. However, I would really like to see a tether buff, given that it only lasts 12 seconds at base if it doesn't have any adds to extend it with, which makes it practically irrelevant for longer fights without enemies surrounding the boss. For example, Witness, as a very recent memory that a lot of you are probably familiar with. We still have Echo of Undermining and Snare Bomb for a 15% weaken source, whether we're talking on maybe a champion or maybe for the end stage of a boss fight when your debuff runs out. You can certainly use Echo of Undermining or Snare Bomb for that, but you know, I would say overall, better debuffing options when it comes to accessing a 30% debuff compared to Void Warlock, but a much weaker damage super overall. So I'm going to go ahead and give this thing a 4 out of 10 for damage, and obviously movement, Void Hunter doesn't really have any access to that, so we're going to give it a score of 18 and a B tier placement. Now, surprising to me, Void Titan has actually escaped the clutches of the D tier and is currently present in the C tier. And that's for 2 reasons and 2 reasons alone. Number 1, I think I underrated the Peregrine Shield Bash invisibility build in stuff like GMs or even in stuff like a Day 1. The only big problem with Void Titan outside of this build is obviously it's a little one-dimensional if that's the only viable build that there is, but I would say neutrally and team play wise, Void Titan doesn't really bring anything to the table that another subclass isn't packing with a much bigger punch. Now, Peregrine Shield Bash I think is not bad, right? It's pretty easy to go invisible and then go ahead and one-shot as some sort of mini boss or a champion and get your entire shield bash back. So I give it a 4 out of 10. I think I did underrate this build a little bit. I thought it was a bit of a joke build, but after seeing some video footage of it and studying up a little bit, I think it is a little bit more serious than I gave it credit for. Survivability wise, you have access to Bastion, which is like a pseudo healing rift. I think Void Overshield does need a bit of a buff in terms of its maximum total HP that it can provide before Bastion becomes, you know, really any stronger than what I've given it credit for here. Control Demolition is obviously pretty good. It's a good way of getting those 90 HP bursts on Volatile Explosions. That being said, I've talked about this before in like the perk tier list, but Volatile is one of the weakest subclass debuffs that you can currently apply to an enemy because it's just not that potent because of its tick rate nerf. So, you know, it's all right. Control Demolition is pretty good, but I feel like it had its heyday when Witch Queen first released, and I feel like people haven't really touched it much since, for better or for worse. Offensive Bulwark does provide a pretty decent regen effect on top of a melee damage buff, but given how quickly Void Overshield gets stripped off of Guardians in today's level of endgame content, with today's level of Void Overshield potency, I wouldn't give it too much credit. Obviously, you have access to Orb Devour and Invis Finisher just like the other Void subclasses, so pretty strong survivability options there. You have Void Overshield as part of your DR. I didn't include Void Overshield on the other 2 subclasses because they don't really have good access to Void Overshield outside of like Repulsor Brace. And then of course you have Ward of Dawn, which provides you with DR while you're inside of it, also gives you that Armor of Light as well. And finally, we have damage. So damage-wise, Twilight Arsenal at base is pretty weak, I would say, not really worth using. So I did mention it here because it does kind of have a burst super damage window, unlike something like Geomag Chaos, for example. So it's not bad. Debuff-wise, you have Echo of Undermining and Twilight Arsenal. You can throw those axes to really keep up a debuff for a long period of time during a damage phase. You have Ward of Dawn as a buff, although I would say probably less reliable than something like Well of Radiance. So overall, I gave Void Titan a 3 out of 10 for boss damage. Twilight Arsenal with no starter, pretty weak, but the ability to keep a weaken up on a boss for an extended period of time without any sort of extension is pretty nice, just repeated procs, pretty simple stuff. And Ward of Dawn is a full 25% buff, even if it's suboptimal compared to something like Well of Radiance. So with 0 points in movement, I'm going to go ahead and place Void Titan in the C tier, like we mentioned, at a total of 12 points. Now, Stasis Warlock is going to be our next tier entry, and that's because Stasis Warlock is the epitome of focusing too much on crowd control without access to sustain or any sort of offensive potential, at least in my opinion. Now, Stasis Warlock's obvious strongest suit is going to be Osmiomancy turret spam. It's been the strongest Stasis Warlock build for pretty much ever since Osmiomancy came out. You're able to get a bunch of different turrets out at the same time, and so it's not a horrible build. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10 for builds, which is not the worst score ever. And survivability wise, I mean, you do have access to Whisper of Refraction Rift regen, which basically guarantees you have a rift for every engagement, given how often you're freezing and defeating targets. As for DR, you have access to Ballador's Rift Frost Armor, but Ballador's is a weaker overall exotic for neutral play compared to something like Osmio. And of course, the neutral access that Stasis Warlock has to Frost Armor is easily the worst of the 3 subclasses, with Glacial Harvest easily being the most mediocre of the harvest aspects by far. Finally, for damage, Stasis Warlock has basically nothing. You have Whisper of Impetus, but it's on Penumbral Blast, which is a slow-moving, slow-range projectile melee. Yeah, really not great stuff. Stasis Warlock doesn't really provide anything for damage. Bleak Watchers are relatively minor chip damage, even if you have something like Whisper of Fissures on. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and give Stasis Warlock a total of 6 points near the bottom of D tier. Next up on our Stasis subclass docket, we have Stasis Hunter. Now, Stasis Hunter might surprise you because I've actually placed it in the B tier, which is a bit of a strange placement compared to something like Solar Hunter or maybe Arc Hunter, and that's for a number of reasons though. I think Renewal Duskfields are the most endgame viable Stasis subclass specific build that currently exists in Destiny, and that's because Renewal Duskfields really solve the problem that Bungie first introduced when making their Frost Armor system, which is it's too annoying and too hard to stack up Frost Armor while constantly going and risking yourself to go and pick up the Stasis shards that you've created. Renewal fixes this by allowing you to create a zone of safety wherever you want, and because of Whisper of Shards, you basically have 100% uptime on this Duskfield. Also, in addition to this, you have Whisper of Rime, which increases your DR to the point where it's competitive with stuff like Woven Mail, and unlike Prismatic Hunter, which doesn't have access to Whisper of Rime, you have a variety of fragments that actually support this playstyle. Now, you might argue that Renewal Sword Arachne is maybe a bit stronger because you can stack both Woven Mail and your Duskfield, but until I test really both iterations of the build, I do believe Renewal has some upsides that Prismatic Hunter can't really claw back away from Stasis Hunter. That being said, I'm not going to rate this too high. I've just given it a nice little 3 out of 10 for builds because I really think that's the only relevant Stasis Hunter build, at least in terms of neutral gameplay. Next up, we have survivability. Now, survivability, we have Renewal Frost Armor, which is pretty good. We also have Winter Shroud. Now, Winter Shroud is a surprisingly decent option for survivability. If you guys are not aware, Winter Shroud gives you 50% DR after your dodge for about 4 seconds, I believe. And given how often you can get your dodge back, given the natural regen increase that Winter Shroud gives you every time you slow a target, not even from its slowing effect, but any slowing effect, it's pretty easy to have this DR all the time. And so survivability, I'm sure you've noticed how good Winter Shroud is on Prismatic Hunter, and yeah, that's because it came from Stasis Hunter, and it's pretty decent on Stasis Hunter even without Combination Blow to refund your dodge all the time. Now, boss damage is really where Stasis Hunter has started to shine recently, at least for me. Silence and Squall got a damage tick rate buff, there's increased shatter damage to bosses as well, so I believe Feast of Light, Silence and Squall is actually a fairly viable damage super, even in the face of Prismatic Nighthawk. And the reason for that is because while you are giving up a bit of burst damage in the short term, in the long term, Whisper of Impetus vastly expands the opportunities to do damage with abilities without standard reload perks, which really expands the pool of weapons that you can do good damage with. As a result, I've given Stasis Hunter a relatively high score of 7 out of 10 for boss damage, and while its neutral status in terms of offensive builds and survivability certainly remains to be seen as people slowly experiment with the Stasis subclasses post-change and kind of fall out of their infatuation with Prismatic right now, I'm sure I'll come to a more solid conclusion on my thoughts on builds and survivability for Stasis Hunter, but I think these scores are relatively conservative for now, and so I'm comfortable with releasing them in this state. Movement-wise, obviously Stasis Hunter has access to Shatter Dive and Shatter Skating, both of which are pretty solid. Stasis Hunter is obviously like the second in command when it comes to movement subclasses, and so I've given it a 2 out of 3 for a total of 16 points in the B tier. Now, unfortunately, our third Stasis subclass is going to fall in the D tier with a total of 5 points, and that's because, well, I mean, I'm sure everybody knows this by now, but it's not really Stasis Titan's fault. Stasis Titan itself, the kit is kind of set up to succeed. It is the only Stasis subclass where you can shoot your own crystals without any sort of enemy feedback or enemy presence and still maintain stuff like Frost Armor and melee regen, and basically you have an infinitely sustaining cycle without any sort of outside input. The only problem with this is that Stasis Titan doesn't really have any supremely strong exotics, and Crystal Shattering is not really what I would call the optimal endgame offensive potential when it comes to abilities and builds. So for that reason, I have to give Stasis Titan kind of a 0 out of 10 for builds. That's not to say that the builds are like unusable, but 0 represents the lowest score out of all of the subclasses. I think Stasis Titan does have the worst builds out of any subclass in the game, at least right now. And this is even after just kind of looking through all the different options like Cadmus Ridge Landscap, like Hoarfrost, like Hoiled Crystal Spam, and even ACD0, Howl the Storm Spam, Synthos. I've looked at all of them and they're all kind of pretty disappointing. And so as a result, I've given Stasis Titan a 0 out of 10, the lowest score for builds. Survivability wise, it's not bad, it's actually pretty decent, right? You have Tectonic Harvest Healing and Frost Armor from the harvest fragments that you create. The nice thing about Stasis Titan compared to the other two Stasis subclasses is that this DR is stackable with just you, like I mentioned, and no other enemies, which makes it a little bit more consistent than something like a Stasis Warlock in particular. Stasis Hunter obviously has access to DR on command with renewal, so maybe it is a bit comparable. So I'm going to go ahead and give Stasis Titan a 4 out of 10 for survivability. Damage wise, there's really only one reason why you use Stasis Titan for damage, and that's for Synthesep's Glacial Quake, which unfortunately does less damage to the relevant targets like Riven than Star Eater Glacial Quake, which is present on Prismatic Titan. So overshadowed again, and very, very niche, this damage super, in terms of what bosses you should really use it on. There's really only a couple bosses on the game where Glacial Quake is relevant for the boss model in question, and of course even on those bosses, yes, Star Eater Scales Prismatic Titan does in fact outperform this subclass. Whisper of Impetus, fun fact, does actually trigger off of Howl of the Storm crystal damage to enemies. It does count as powered melee damage, as you guys know. Those crystals are coded as such, but that's certainly not particularly useful for damage, and so I'm going to go ahead and give Stasis Titan a 1 out of 10 for boss damage. Movement wise, I'm not going to give this thing any credit for like Shiver Strike. It's not really used in any sort of relevant speedrun or movement tech, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a 0, and we're going to call it at that with a total of 5 points near the bottom of D tier. Starting off our list of Strand subclasses, we have Strand Warlock. Now, Strand Warlock is not bad. I'm going to go ahead and place it in the C tier. Unfortunately, its use as the damage specialist has kind of been surpassed by the sheer amount of burst damage that a Star Eater Nova coming from a Prismatic Warlock can do. I know I'm talking about Prismatic a lot here, and so you probably know where Prismatic is going to land at the end of this tier list, but not to spoil anything, let's continue. Strand Warlock, build-wise, Weaver's Trance Suspend with like Osteo and Necrotic and stuff like that, it's not very good. It's pretty weapon dependent, and so I wouldn't consider it to be hugely on the merit of Strand Warlock in particular. There's some other builds that you can use with this thing, like, Weave Walk and Threadling Generation. You can spam like Wanderer Tangles, but in my opinion, none of them really hold a candle to truly strong offensive builds, especially in today's meta. Couple that with the lack of survivability on Strand Warlock as well. You have to give up an entire aspect if you want access to on-command DR, and when you do have that DR, you lose all of your offensive presence. You are building, of course, Purge Threadlings, but you do lose all of your offensive presence by not being able to use any of your abilities and such. So, Strand Warlock does have some, I suppose, unique utility in its survivability, where you can gain all of that DR if you want to like tank a boss or something for your teammates, or, maybe survive some sort of mechanic where you take a lot of damage, but you're sacrificing an entire aspect's worth of offensive potential in order to have something that other subclasses already have, which is, high DR. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to give Weave Walk and the survivability of Needlestorm a 2 out of 10, and the builds for Strand Warlock a 1 out of 10. With the damage of Strand Warlock, there is a bit of a redemption to be had. Strand Warlock has Thread of Evolution Needlestorm, which is one of Warlock's best burst damage supers. Obviously not quite as good as Star Eater Nova, so I can't give this thing a 10, but Strand Warlock does have really good access to Thread of Ascent plus Generation grapples. It is easily the subclass, I would say, that makes the best use of the Strand kit for damage. You have 3 Unraveling Melees, which are very, very quick to cast. You have a Needlestorm, which is a great punch for burst damage. You have very, very quickly regenerating grapples, which gives you essentially a handling boost, a reload boost, and a free weapon reload pretty much every time your grapple is up. So pretty strong stuff. I'm going to go ahead and give it the same score for boss damage as Stasis Hunter. Both subclasses have access to a decent damage super that's slightly suboptimal, along with a lot of quality of life reload access for weapon focused rotations. Finally, movement wise, Strand Warlock does have access to Grapple and Wanderer Tangles, so I'm going to give it a 1 for that. Not quite a 2, given that Stasis Hunter was given a 2, and that's going to give this thing a total amount of 11 points for a solid C tier placement. Strand Hunter is up next. Now this one was a bit of an interesting one for me. Strand Hunter was one of the subclasses where when I was initially discussing it, I knew kind of very little about, because it was seldom used in speedrunning, seldom used in optimal play. I know a lot of people enjoyed using this thing in like GMs and solo dungeons and stuff, but it always felt like kind of a gimmick to me. So I put my head to work and I started listening to a lot of your comments, and I investigated a little bit with Strand Hunter, and what I found was that Whirling Maelstrom is a bit better than I expected. It does a fair bit of splash damage. It unravels targets. It's almost its own form of crowd control in a way, because of how much stagger it does, how much it can tear through enemies, and it lasts for a surprisingly long time as well. However, I wouldn't say that Strand Hunter's base kit provides a huge amount that a lot of other subclasses don't already provide in spades. So the build wise, I'm going to say Whirling Maelstrom is pretty decent. uptime is not amazing. The actual Whirling Maelstrom itself is pretty decent, and it's kind of like a shoe-in for like some sort of roaming grenade. Survivability wise, Strand Hunter actually was surprisingly not bad. You have Threaded Spectre Diaggro, which has rightfully been pointed out to me as kind of an equivalent to Void Invisibility, except that you can continue shooting, so not bad at all. We have Threat of Warding, which is, it's been nerfed to 5 seconds, but you have Surturacne's Facade on this subclass as well, which makes Strand Hunter undoubtedly the subclass with the easiest access to permanent Woven Mail uptime, which cannot be ignored. Now, obviously, survivability-wise, Strand Hunter doesn't really have access to some sort of healing source, but it has Diaggro, it has Woven Mail, pretty much all the time, and so survivability-wise, I can give it a score that's pretty much right underneath Solar Titan at a 5, which is surprisingly a lot higher than I thought I would initially give it. Now, damage-wise, a Strand Hunter, even Starred or Silk Strike, it has decent total damage, but compared to the absolute titans of burst damage that we have right now, is generally not really relevant unless you want to extend your total damage across a long phase. But realistically speaking, I mean, this subclass does have access to Thread of Ascent Grapple and Widow's Silk on top of that, which is, not a bad combo to have, but not really much I can give it credit for in the grand scheme of things when it comes to playing endgame content in an effective way. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a 1 out of 10. Obviously, Strand Hunter also has access to grapple. You can make the argument that it has, better access to grappling, given that it has access to Widow's Silk and Silk Strike, which gives you basically infinite grapples. But, that's not really enough to raise this thing to the level of the 2 points that I gave to Shatter Skating on Stasis Hunter. So Strand Hunter is going to have to be happy with a total of 10 points, which gives it a C tier placement. And finally, our last pre-final shape subclass is going to fill in our tier list nicely, fill that gaping hole that we have in the A tier with Strand Titan. So, Berserker is pretty decent overall across the board. Build-wise, Synthecep's Wormgod Grapple Melee with stuff like Navigator is still pretty strong. You can give your teammates Woven Mail, it has good sustain through Banner of War, it has excellent champ/mini-boss burst damage, and it can provide your teammates with a sword/melee damage boost when it comes to boss DPS as well. Survivability-wise, I think Banner of War survivability has gone down a fair amount ever since the Woven Mail nerf, the Into the Fray nerf, you have the Banner of War nerf as well in terms of sustain. However, it's not bad. I think most people agree that Strand Titan has slightly worse survivability than Solar Titan. Solar Titan leaves sunspots everywhere that are sort of areas of safety that don't require constant kill commitment, so a lot of downtime periods are kind of permissible with Solar Titan. You also have access to Cure on hit with your mini hammer, something that Strand Titan really kind of struggles with. Strand Titan has good sustain with those healing pulses from Banner of War, but doesn't really have any clutch on demand stuff like Healing Grenade compared to Solar Titan. So that's why I gave it a score of 5 out of 10 compared to Solar Titan 6. As for damage, you have Banner of War grapple melees, which are still prevalent today on some bosses in particular. You also have Banner of War, which can give your teammates an additional healing pulse on top of any sort of restoration effects that they might be having. You can give them a melee 40% damage increase, a sword 10% damage increase, which is relevant on some bosses like Herald and Crota, and of course you have access to Thread of Ascent Grapple, which means that if you're using any shotgun without some sort of reload like Grave Robber or Demo or Cast No Shadows, Thread of Ascent basically saves your bacon with those shotguns and allows you to use them indefinitely as long as you are continuously grappling. So as a result, I'm going to go ahead and give Strand Titan a 6 out of 10. Obviously, Blade Fury is not phenomenal, and obviously Strand Titan itself is a little situational, but when that situation comes in and you need to do sword damage or melee damage, it's hard to find a subclass that really does significantly better than Strand Titan. In fact, I can only think of one, and so I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. Grapple gets 1 out of 3 as usual, and that's going to give Strand Titan a total of 19 points, which places it solidly in the A tier. And now for the moment you've all been waiting for, it's time to talk about Prismatic. First up, I'm going to go ahead and put Prismatic Warlock in the A tier. Now, Prismatic Warlock, when it comes to factors and scoring, it almost had it all. The only miss, in my opinion, was really when it comes to builds. Now, I've played the builds, I've seen other people play the builds, and while Buddy Spam, Turret Spam, Hellion, Arc Soul, Bleak Watcher, or even Synthecep's Lightning Surge, which is arguably kind of worse, they're not bad. They're certainly very easy to play. In fact, if we had a factor or a score for ease of use, or if this was a tier list based on risk to reward or effort to reward ratio, then Prismatic Warlock would undoubtedly be higher scored. The problem that I have with Prismatic Warlock is very simple. If we go ahead and look at the builds that it has access to, if we compare its ability to clear rooms of adds, clear rooms of champions with the likes of Prismatic Hunter or the likes of Prismatic Titan, the difference is night and day. And so as a result, I gave Prismatic Warlock's build score a 6 out of 10, which is certainly not bad, by the way, certainly not bad. There are other subclasses in this tier list that would certainly look on with envy, but at the end of the day, I think Prismatic Warlock's builds are relatively limited by the aspect selection that Bungie gave, much like what I talked about when I was talking about day 1 final shape builds. I said this then, and I'm saying it now. I believe the aspect selection that was given to Prismatic Warlock, given the versatility of exotic class items that we currently have in the game, the aspect selection ended up relatively disappointing, in my opinion. And so as a result, I'm giving it a build score of a 6 out of 10. Now, in terms of survivability and damage, I have much better things to say. Survivability wise, Prismatic Warlock has access to Enhanced Devour, so full heal on kill, good grenade regen. We have access to Phoenix Dive for on-command healing. We have Healing Grenade for more on-command healing, even if it's just Resto times 1. Facet of Purpose gives us Resto if we're on Solar, Void Overshield if we're on Void, Woven Mail if we're on Strand, plenty of options. Damage Resist, you have Song of Flame for solo and for team content, Transcendence, which gives you 20% natural DR when you cast it, and Facet of Protection, which gives you 15% DR, not the same as, Spark of Resistance, but 15% DR when you're surrounded by enemies. So survivability wise, Prismatic Warlock is pretty, pretty good. It's got it going pretty good. It's an 8 out of 10, right? Now, damage-wise, this is where Prismatic Warlock really shines. Abilities, you have Feast of Light, ×6, Cataclysm Nova, you have Arcane Needle, Unravel, you have your buddy damage, of course, which comes from your Stasis turrets, your Hellions, your Arc Souls, your etc, etc. You have Debuff from Facet of Dominance, Freezing Singularity, which is essentially all the benefits of Void Warlock. So as long as you have Transcendence going into damage, you can essentially extend a 30% debuff infinitely, right? You have Vortex Grenade, you have your Freezing Singularity, and of course, you have buffs from Facet of Dawn, you have Facet of Courage, you have Song of Flame. So there's so many things that Prismatic Warlock kind of brings to the table. Now, the only thing Prismatic Warlock really is missing is a reload assist, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to dock points for that, given how chocked full to the brim of great damage options that Prismatic Warlock has access to. So as a result, 10 out of 10. Movement, you also have access to Blink, so sure, I'll give it a 1 out of 3. And that's going to result in a total of 25 points for Prismatic Warlock, which places it solidly at the top of A tier. Second on our list of Prismatic subclasses is, of course, Prismatic Hunter. Now, Prismatic Hunter is going to be our second S tier subclass, and that's because I've given this thing basically perfect scores in every single scoring factor. Number 1, build-wise, this thing has a variety of builds. In terms of versatility, obviously Prismatic is still a relatively young set of subclasses. However, I think Prismatic Hunter, aspect-wise, remember, Prismatic is almost entirely determined, its viability is almost entirely determined by the aspect selection that Bungie gave to all of these subclasses. And when it comes to band for band, aspect for aspect, Prismatic Warlock has much weaker aspects. Just generally speaking, it has much weaker aspects, and as a result, as people tend to trickle in to the game and try different builds, try different aspect combinations with different exotic class items, I think Prismatic Hunter has a lot more room to grow, and I think it's already grown past Prismatic Warlock by a fair margin. You have Gunpowder Gamble spam if that's your thing, you have Grapple Melee spam if that's your thing, you have Combination Blow spam if that's your thing. There are just so many strong options that are available on Prismatic Hunter, and these are just the offensive builds. I'm not even including the defensive options, for example, Gerfalcon, Renewal, Surturachne, that Prismatic Hunter has access to, that I would say are maybe even arguably stronger than what Prismatic Warlock has access to. Survivability wise, you have Stylish Executioner Invisibility. Now the problem with Void Hunter and Stylish was that Void debuffs are not as easy to access as maybe other debuffs, for example, like Scorching, like Incandescent, right? Stylish Executioner now works with any debuffed kill. You can slice an enemy, you can scorch an enemy, you can volt shot an enemy, you can do any of these things to an enemy, and it will proc Stylish Executioner. This is basically free invisibility if you're using any sort of meta, primary, or heavy, or special weapon that has been released in the past 2 years. Every 2 seconds. It's just free invisibility every 2 seconds, right? On top of that, Stylish Executioner also has massively increased melee damage when you come out of your invisibility. You can weaken targets when you come out of your invisibility. You have Threaded Spectre de-aggro. You have Combination Blow healing, which is just doesn't even require an aspect, it's just your melee. You have Facet of Purpose, just like all the other Prismatic subclasses have. DR-wise, you have Spirit of Renewal plus Surturachne. You have Transcendence DR, you have Facet of Protection like we talked about, and of course you have Winter's Shroud. Winter's Shroud is really, really strong, guys. It gives you 50% DR every time you dodge, and because of the way that Combination Blow builds cycle, you have this DR pretty much all of the time. And so Prismatic Hunter is excellent survivability wise. I never thought I'd give a melee build 9 out of 10 when it comes to survivability, but Prismatic Hunter is really just that easy to use. You don't even need to use a melee build, just stylish alone and like an incandescent aberrant action is enough to really get you through any content. Survivability wise, you can go invis pretty much whenever you want. You can wait out your 2 stylish cooldown, you can take your time, or you can go in guns blazing and be as aggressive as you want. So survivability wise, Prismatic Hunter is really a jack of all trades. The only thing that it's really missing is maybe some really strong healing, or maybe sort of like a clutch option like a Well of Radiance, where you can place it down if you are ever in a significant amount of danger and you have to get out in a short amount of time. Now, damage-wise, abilities, I mean, Prismatic Hunter kind of has everything, right? Facet of Courage boosted Celestial Goldie. We have Stylish Executioner, Syntheseps Grapple Melee, which if those aren't nerfed, every single grapple melee does more than a Nighthawk per grapple melee, which is, I don't think I need to tell you how broken that is, right? You have self-buffing options through Facet of Dawn, Facet of Courage, which can be cycled using Transcendent melees. You have Snare Bomb, which basically guarantees a 15% debuff for an entire damage phase, given that you are Transcendent going into it. So I have no choice really but to give this the same score as I did for Warlock. You know, a weaker damage super, but in exchange, a melee build that is just as potent as pre-nerf, if not more potent than pre-nerf Strand Grapple Melee Titan. And of course, you have all the access to constant buff and debuff, much like Warlock does. So a 10 out of 10 I think is warranted. And movement-wise, Blink Grapple Ascension, again, not as good as Shatter Skating. Just going to give it, you know, kind of the bare minimum of 1 out of 3. So with a total of 30 points, Prismatic Hunter is going to make its first appearance on this tier list in the S tier. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Prismatic Titan. Now, Prismatic Titan, the only major problem with Prismatic Titan is obviously there's only one build that really Prismatic Titans tend to run, and that's Syntho Consecration. Whether it's with Assassin or Hoyle is kind of dependent on what kind of content you're playing, what kind of player you are. But yeah, Prismatic Titans tend to really just run Syntho Consecration. Now, that build alone is incredibly strong, right? It's incredibly strong, especially the Hoyle variant, I think, given how spammable your Frenzied Blade comes up. It's just, you know, it's incredibly potent. I don't think I need to tell you how good it is given the amount of GM speedrunning you've probably seen with it recently, even in minus 25 or I suppose minus 20 content, so like contest mode level content. This thing, it shreds. This build just absolutely shreds. I'm not really sure if there is a stronger build on Prismatic Titan given the other aspects that it has access to are not particularly notable, I would say. So maybe not as versatile as something like Prismatic Hunter, but even just the build itself, it's just so strong overall. At least offensively, we're going to talk about defense in a second, but at least offensively, it's deserving, in my opinion, of a 9 out of 10. Now, survivability wise, this is where Prismatic Titan kind of falters a little bit. Sustain wise, you really only have access to knockout healing and Facet of Purpose, which is like, knockout healing is fine. You're getting kills pretty constantly with Consecration, so you're going to receive this chunk healing fairly often. And Facet of Purpose, well, a lot of Prismatic Titans are running Twilight Arsenal, so you're going to get Void Overshield pretty often. Damage resistance, you don't really have any constant and additional sources like Winter Shroud or maybe the Frost Armor from Renewal. You really only have access to your Transcendence DR. You have Faceted Protection if you're surrounded, and if you're in the middle of consecrating on an enemy, then you're also going to have some in-air DR as well. Finally, damage-wise, this is easily Prismatic's weakest showing when it comes to boss DPS assistance. We have Feast of Light Twilight Arsenal, which is just okay, right? It's certainly worse than the other two supers that Prismatic has presented us with when it comes to leading burst damage. Feast of Light Glacial Quake is, I suppose, a contender for best super for Riven DPS, but besides that, really doesn't see much play in my opinion. Buff wise, we have, you know, Facet of Dawn, Facet of Courage, the usual. Spirit of the Eternal Warrior is, I suppose, a bit of an interesting Titan exclusive option for a really long amount of 4 surges. So you can run 4-3 on your surges, or maybe a holster mod without any sort of downside compared to the other subclasses. So that's something unique that was pointed out to me. And then of course, debuff wise, you have access to Twilight Arsenal. But if you're Transcendent, notably if you're Transcendent, Titan doesn't have any access to infinite spammable abilities that debuff, right? On Warlock, you have stuff like your Vortex Grenade with Facet of Dominance. You have access to Freezing Singularity, which also debuffs. On Hunter, you have Snare Bomb. On Titan, you could theoretically run Facet of Dominance for your single-use Void Grenade when you're not Transcendent, but when you are Transcendent, your Grenade Electrified Snare doesn't have any Void component, so it can't debuff, and none of your melee abilities debuff either. So you're going to have to rely on using Twilight Arsenal and making axes and chucking them at opportune moments in order to keep debuff up on the boss for a suitable amount of time, especially for longer phases. As a result, Prismatic Titan's getting a total of 19 points, which places it solidly in the A tier. Now that we've talked about all of these subclasses, why don't we go ahead and look at the overall score review so we can see exactly where these subclasses align within the actual tiers themselves. So as you can see, Solar Warlock and Prismatic Hunter are tied with 30 points each. In the A tier, I've reordered here. Prismatic Warlock is a fair chunk above Strand Titan and Prismatic Titan, which I've placed at equal positions. We have, of course, Void Hunter at 18 points, then Void Warlock and Stasis Hunter tied at 16, then Solar Titan at 15. Then at the start of our C tier, we have Arc Hunter and Void Titan tied at 12 points. We have Solar Hunter and Strand Warlock at 11 points, and we have Strand Hunter at 10 points. And to round things off in our D tier, we have Arc Warlock, Stasis Warlock, and then we have, tied for last place, Arc Titan and Stasis Titan. Man, what a journey that was. We just went through every single subclass in the game, exhaustively talking about all the builds that are generally used on every subclass, all the damage options that they provide, you know, survivability. We've talked about pretty much everything that constitutes a subclass. Now, some of these rankings might be a little bit interesting to you guys, but I think I'm fairly confident about all of my placements here. Obviously, as someone who is more kind of optimal gameplay focused compared to maybe other content creators or other players, you know, Stasis Hunter might rank a little bit high here. Maybe Strand Warlock might rank a little higher. But besides that, I think this tier list is pretty solid. I think it's pretty agreeable as well. And like I said the last time I made a tier list like this, I don't genuinely believe that any subclass in the game is like legitimately unplayable in endgame content. Even Stasis Titan, I mean, even with its lackluster crystal damage and even with its lack of really good supportive exotics, you can still use it in something like a day one. And if you're a good player, you can make it work. But, you know, if you want to have the easiest time, or if we want to talk about academically, when we're talking about all the different facets of what makes a subclass shine in endgame content, I do think this is a fairly accurate ranking. Now, in terms of fragments and aspects, I'm not going to make individual videos on those tier lists, but I have actually updated them this season. I took them a lot more seriously this season. I got a lot of feedback from you guys because a lot of you guys had a lot of criticisms, valid criticisms, I will say, a lot of feedback, a lot of support. So I appreciate all of that you guys left for me. Fragment wise, we've added all the prismatic facets in here: facet of honor, facet of sacrifice, etc, etc. I've revamped the fragment tier list to have a G and an H tier because I thought it deserved to be a little bit more precise in its rating system. But I do think this fragment tier list is way more accurate than it was last time. It also accounts for all the stuff like the Empyrean nerf and stuff like that. So lots of good adjustments here. Aspect tier list was also redone recently as well, with considerations for prismatic in mind. So obviously I tried to be a bit predictive with my last aspect tier list, and I tried to talk about aspects as if they were going to be available on prismatic, but I don't think nobody, even me, could have predicted you know, stuff like stylish executioner being all debuffed kills, giving invisibility, for example. So, you know, that has easily bumped up stylish up to the top spot. But if you're curious about the other options, the tier list is going to be in the description as usual. You can go ahead and check it out for yourself. You can maybe leave a comment, an argument, whatever really you want. Yeah, this is pretty much the last tier list that you guys are going to be familiar with that I'm going to work on this season. The only remaining tier list that I have to make / update is the archetype tier list, which I think will be quite interesting. A solid meta discussion to be had there. So I'm excited to discuss all of that with you. I will certainly learn some more, which I'm excited. I'm always enthusiastic to learn new things, crunch new numbers rather than kind of reiterating or updating old things. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about that with you guys. That should be out within the next day or two. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say, and I'll see you guys later. Bye for now.